What everyone idealizes, but in real life it's terrible? Lavish weddings are one of the most overrated expenses people feel pressured into. If a family genuinely has the money and wants to spend it that way, that's their choice. But going into debt, or draining your parents' savings, for a single day of celebration is a terrible trade-off. On top of the financial strain, large, expensive weddings are often incredibly stressful. They require months of planning, tight coordination, and endless compromises, all to pull off an event that's over in a matter of hours. What's supposed to be a joyful milestone frequently turns into an anxiety-filled production. That same money could be put toward a far more meaningful investment: a down payment on a home, long-term financial security, or even a home and a memorable vacation together. Those choices create lasting value rather than fleeting spectacle. The real issue is the belief that a big wedding is somehow necessary. It isn't. People are often chasing expectations, social pressure, or appearances rather than making a decision that actually serves their future. A marriage doesn't start stronger because the party was more expensive, and pretending otherwise is one of the costliest myths people buy into. Startup and hustle culture sells a fantasy. Work 16 hours a day, sleep 4, sacrifice everything, and someday it will all be worth it. In reality, it rarely pays off. What does happen, almost every time, is burnout, along with damaged health, strained relationships, and a life that slowly shrinks down to nothing but work. Hustle culture is just burnout dressed up in motivational language. It repackages exhaustion as ambition and self-neglect as discipline. And most of what gets labeled as hustling isn't even entrepreneurship or creative risk-taking. It's simply overworking, rebranded to sound noble instead of exploitative. Modern grind culture is just old-fashioned labor abuse with better PR. The term side hustle is especially insidious. It's framed as empowerment, but in practice it functions like propaganda. Instead of questioning why full-time work no longer pays enough to live comfortably, people are encouraged to feel proud for working even more. Rather than addressing unfair wages or rising costs of living, the solution becomes optimize yourself and squeeze productivity out of every remaining hour. What's been lost is the idea that people are allowed to have hobbies purely for enjoyment. Activities that once existed for rest, curiosity, or joy are now expected to justify themselves financially. Every passion must be monetized, every interest turned into a brand, because infinite quarterly growth demands that nothing in life remain unproductive. In my experience, many people who fully buy into hustle culture don't actually have much else going on. Work becomes their identity because it's the only place they feel valued or differentiated. They often have few close friendships, minimal family connection, and no real outlets outside their profession, so they fill that emptiness with more work and call it purpose. You see this pattern clearly in certain industries, especially among high-level chefs. There are exceptions, people who deliberately carve out space away from the kitchen, but many are only somebody within their professional bubble. Outside of it, they have little life to return to. Their entire sense of self is tied to their output, their status, and their endurance. That isn't success. It's survival masquerading as ambition. I think about the Old West a lot, and honestly, it must have been absolutely miserable. The way it's romanticized today barely resembles what life was actually like. The food alone would have been a constant struggle, not to mention the living conditions, especially in towns and cities where sanitation was primitive at best. Medical care was rudimentary, unreliable, and often dangerous. And the climate? Try surviving in places like Arizona or Texas with no air conditioning, no modern insulation, and limited access to clean water. My own family history makes this feel very real. My great-grandmother was essentially sold into marriage in 1907 for reasons which, as family lore later revealed, involved escaping a lesbian relationship that wasn't socially survivable at the time. She was put on a train in New England and sent all the way to northern New Mexico, where she married a man she barely knew. They lived on a ranch in what could generously be described as a dugout shack. I've only seen it in photographs, but it was bleak. A small, ugly structure with rags for curtains and a door made of 4 boards nailed together. That was home. She dealt with brutal weather, rattlesnakes, food and water insecurity, and a violently alcoholic husband. The cattle regularly died in ways that were both sudden and gruesome. On top of that, she endured 9 pregnancies. Only 3 children survived past birth. In the early 1920s, she finally left him. They remained legally married, but she took her children to a nearby mining town and started over. She became a school teacher and was provided housing. My grandmother later described that transition as feeling like Dorothy arriving in Oz. For the first time, they had proper windows, a door that actually shut, indoor plumbing, and electricity. It must have felt miraculous. I think about her often, how much endurance was demanded of people back then just to exist. I grew up in Arizona, and for a couple of years I worked at a low-budget landscaping company. One summer, I spent every workday in a truck with no air conditioning. The only way to cool off was to get on the freeway, roll the windows down, and let 120-degree air blast over sweat-soaked skin. It was utterly miserable. And that was with modern conveniences, knowing I could go home to AC at the end of the day. Imagining that as a permanent condition makes the Old West feel less like a frontier and more like a slow punishment. The same goes for medieval times. If a modern person were dropped into a medieval city, they'd probably pass out from the smell alone. Human waste, animal waste, rotting food, smoke, everything piled together. It's not exaggeration to say that many people today live better than kings did back then. What's especially strange is how distorted our sense of time is. The so-called Wild West era lasted maybe 30 years, yet it looms enormous in popular culture, as if it spanned centuries. Meanwhile, the Confederacy existed for just 5 years, and yet some people still build their entire identity around it. Even dystopian science fiction falls into this trap. Those worlds feel dramatic because we're following the protagonist, but the overwhelming majority of people in those settings are just peasants, laborers, or slaves, living bleak, constrained lives off-screen. Survival isn't heroic when it's routine, it's just grinding. History wasn't cooler, tougher, or more authentic. It was harsher, uglier, and far more lethal. Remembering that doesn't diminish resilience. It puts into perspective just how much suffering we tend to romanticize after the fact. Trap, drill, and gangster rap culture is fascinating on the surface, but it's also deeply troubling. Everyone wants to be a gangster or be associated with one until they confront the reality of that lifestyle. Kids buy music that directly funds people who are living violent, dangerous lives. The lyrics, videos, and narratives often glorify murder, crime, and conflict, framing them as glamorous or aspirational. It's a type of romanticism that mirrors how war is often glorified, convincing people that a life of constant danger and conflict will make them heroic or powerful. I'm convinced that a lot of the violence in rap during the late 1990s and early 2000s was fueled by hype and competition among the artists themselves. At the time, I assumed it was exaggeration, just persona building. But looking closer, it's real. Consider artists like King Von, Pooh Shiesty, Youngboy NBA, and many others. There's documented involvement in shootings, disputes over territory, and even murder-for-hire situations. While mainstream radio may filter this content, much of it exists on streaming platforms and social media, gaining niche but intensely loyal followings. Scenes like the Jacksonville rap community show just how far this can go. Lyrics mocking real-life murder victims, music videos depicting disrespect at gravesites, all feeding an audience hungry for shock and drama. One friend once told me, "You can't be a good rapper unless you've committed serious crimes." I was stunned. That idea linking musical credibility to criminal behavior, feels backward. In most societies, someone who commits crimes tries to avoid attention, not broadcast it to millions. Yet here, crime is not only celebrated but monetized, performed like a badge of honor. It sends a message that the most destructive behaviors are the ones worth noticing. Beyond the music, there's another reality. People who live criminal lifestyles aren't the charming, larger-than-life figures rap often paints them to be. I've met men involved in gangs and organized crime, and the truth is harsh. They are difficult to be around, selfish, impulsive, and abrasive. Relationships are transactional. There are no true friends, only associates. Social niceties and emotional bonds are often non-existent because treating others poorly has become habitual, even purposeful. These are not heroes. They are people trapped in cycles of violence, ego, and self-interest. The culture creates a feedback loop. Young people see the glamorized version of violence, aspire to it, or accept it as normal, while the people living it often suffer isolation, mistrust, and tragedy. Meanwhile, the music continues to spread these ideas, profiting from the very chaos it depicts. It's an uncomfortable truth. The allure is there, but the consequences are real, and they're often devastating. Online, there's a strange trend of romanticizing certain mental health and neurodivergent conditions, BPD and autism being prime examples. And as someone who actually has both, diagnosed professionally and not via some online quiz, let me tell you, it's not fun. It's not whimsical. It's not cute. It's not some quirky gift that makes life cinematic. It's real life. And real life is hard. Yes, the memes are funny. And yes, I make jokes about my issues now, especially after years of therapy, medication, and conscious work on myself. But there's only so much humor can do. There's no magical medication for autism. There's no one pill that fixes a cluster B personality disorder. You either put in the work to make sure your trauma doesn't end up causing trauma to others, or you sink. It's that serious. So why, I can't help but wonder, do some people romanticize it? Imagine saying, I want to experience some of the worst trauma in childhood, the kind that rewires my brain, so that as an adult I have to actively manage panic attacks and obsessive fears of abandonment over things as small as a missing emoji. How is that desirable? How is that something anyone would actually want? The BPD plus autism combo, in particular, is treated online as some exotic, edgy personality type. But in reality, it's exhausting. It's work, constant emotional and cognitive labor just to maintain stability, to keep yourself grounded, to navigate relationships without unintentionally hurting people you care about. And yet, I'll scroll through social media and see people wishing they had it. Or worse, romanticizing it in a partner. The manic pixie dream girl, the yandere archetype, the quirky neurodivergent crush. Then they actually date someone with BPD who's on the spectrum. And suddenly, the fantasy collides with reality. The person isn't a storybook character. They're a human being dealing with real challenges. And society's reaction is brutal. Misunderstandings, vilification, and judgment flood in. That quirky girl is now a problem, a cautionary tale, a caricature of their imagined fantasy. It's exhausting, and honestly, it's infuriating. Mental illness and neurodivergence aren't aesthetic choices, they're lived experiences. They require work, patience, and often struggle. And yet people continue to treat them as if they're fashion statements or plot devices in someone else's story. I've done the work. I've fought to regulate myself, stay grounded, and live responsibly. I'm proud of the progress I've made. But seeing random strangers online wishing for the very conditions that have caused me years of pain and effort, it makes me sick to my stomach. Because BPD and autism aren't quirky traits to admire. They're real challenges. And romanticizing them diminishes the lived reality of the people who actually navigate these conditions every single day. La Cosa Nostra. Ah, yes. The thing of ours. The the subject that gets whispered about in hushed tones, romanticized on screens, and mythologized in pop culture. But let's be honest, the reality was nothing like what the movies make it out to be. My father, for one, absolutely despised the Godfather films. He would scoff at the glowing depictions of mobsters with their sharp suits, calm composure, and clever schemes. To him, those movies glorified men who were, in reality, heartless, brutal bullies, parasitical figures who terrorized poor immigrant shopkeepers and families that could least afford it. The protection money they collected wasn't some quaint tradition. It was theft from people struggling to survive, enforced through fear and violence. There was no honor in it. None. Only exploitation. Even the characters who seemed charming or sophisticated in these films? Pure myth. Pop culture gave the mob class, coolness, and wealth. It suggested that yes, these men did bad things, but only to bad people, and somehow that justified their lives. My father would shake his head at the absurdity of it all, emphasizing that any real mobster he knew, or had heard about, was ruthless and self-serving, not some romanticized hero with a code of honor. Then there's Goodfellas, which manages to show a sliver of the truth behind why someone like Henry Hill might have been attracted to that life. The fast money, the power, the excitement. It was seductive. But it also subtly reveals the consequences that come with it: betrayal, paranoia, and the constant looming threat of violence. It's the allure of glamour wrapped around a deeply dangerous and morally bankrupt lifestyle. Hill's eventual decision to leave the mob highlights that reality rarely matches the fantasy. The thing about La Cosa Nostra, though, is that its image has been warped by cinema and media. Thanks in part to the mob's own influence, they funded films, consulted on scripts, and ensured their world looked glamorous. Most portrayals lean heavily into the mythology. The brutal extortion, the murders over petty disputes, the terror inflicted on ordinary families, they get glossed over, or worse, turned into compelling drama. Pop culture made these criminals appear intelligent, classy, and even honorable, when in truth, they were manipulative and destructive. So when people casually ask, "What's this mob you speak of?" it's hard not to sigh. The answer isn't stylish. It's terrifying, predatory, and utterly devoid of the romanticism that Hollywood has made so familiar. Pop culture has reduced the reality of organized crime into something digestible, entertaining, and stylish. But it strips away the intelligence and humanity of those who were actually affected. The truth is far uglier than any movie, no matter how iconic. Next time someone glorifies mobsters in conversation, remember, behind the suits, the cigars, and the dramatic dialogue, there were lives destroyed, families terrified, and communities extorted. That's the story the movies won't tell you. The real La Cosa Nostra wasn't about honor. It was about power, greed, and fear. The Amish. On the surface, they seem to live a peaceful, simple life removed from the chaos of the modern world. Pictures of horse-drawn buggies, hand-sewn clothing, and quiet farms paint a picture of tranquility. But what lurks beneath that surface is far more complicated, and frankly, disturbing. Growing up as a Mennonite, which shares many cultural ties with the Amish, I saw firsthand that removing a community from modern society doesn't make the people in it inherently good. Humans are humans, no matter how isolated they are. Even in these tightly knit, faith-based communities, the very same patterns of abuse, neglect, and cruelty that exist elsewhere can flourish in silence. In Amish and Mennonite communities, there are reports of rape, incest, sexual abuse, and mistreatment of both women and animals. Puppy mills, poor animal husbandry, and the rigid enforcement of patriarchal authority can be found alongside the idyllic farms and pastoral landscapes. I want to be clear. Not every Amish person is abusive or cruel. Many are genuinely kind, hardworking, and deeply devoted to their faith and family. But the culture itself, one that prizes obedience over individual autonomy, tradition over questioning, and secrecy over transparency, creates an environment where abuse can thrive unchecked. Without accountability, without scrutiny from the outside world, harmful behavior often goes unnoticed and unpunished. It's easy for outsiders to romanticize the Amish lifestyle as some kind of cottagecore fantasy, a return to a slower, gentler way of life. But I can tell you from experience, that's a surface-level understanding. Life in these communities demands a level of discipline, labor, and social conformity that can be crushing. Children are expected to work from a young age, women often have little agency in decisions, and stepping outside the rules of the community can come with social ostracization. Or worse. Trauma, both subtle and overt, is common. I've spoken with people now working in mental health who left these communities and carried significant emotional scars as a result. I remember watching Breaking Amish, a reality show about young Amish people exploring the outside world, and being struck by how much fear, confusion, and even anxiety came through in their stories. Hearing them talk about their upbringing, the rules, the expectations, the hidden traumas, it was jarring. You could sense how constricted and dangerous life could feel, even in a community that outwardly seems serene. What stands out most to me is this: isolation does not erase the darker parts of human nature. People can still be abusive, cruel, or neglectful, even if they live far from modern technology or society. The only things that truly mitigate human cruelty are transparency, accountability, and oversight. Shine a light on abuse, expose it, punish it, and you reduce the opportunity for it to continue. Leaving these communities and seeing the world differently is freeing, but it also gives perspective. While Amish and Mennonite life has admirable qualities, community, simplicity, focus on family, it is not inherently utopian. Hard work, faith, and discipline don't erase human failings. Humans are humans, and sometimes humans can really profoundly suck. Working in a commercial kitchen or restaurant is almost always completely different from how TV and movies make it look. On screen, it's always this glamorous, cinematic affair. You're an artist with knives, plating dishes like a painter with a canvas, chasing after the aloof waitress you always banter with, and somehow every night ends with a steamy romantic scene in the rain, followed by a luxurious lobster ravioli and a passionate all-night romp in a stylish apartment overlooking Central Park. It's seductive, dramatic, and endlessly appealing in fiction. The reality? It's often nothing like that. More often than not, a night in a real kitchen is a lesson in controlled chaos, patience, and occasionally self-preservation. During a shift, you're juggling a dozen tasks at once, running food, plating perfectly, keeping the expeditor from screaming, managing the line cooks who are half asleep or half caffeinated, and dealing with customers who somehow think yelling from across the dining room will speed up your mise en place. And then there are the characters. Every kitchen has them. There's the guy who seems like a regular human being until he's had a double espresso, and suddenly you're subtly avoiding him because he's bouncing off the walls with a speed-fueled mania. Maybe he's got a criminal past, maybe not. But the mix of adrenaline, exhaustion, and too much caffeine can make anyone a little scary. Sometimes you narrowly dodge fistfights over a dropped plate, a misread ticket, or the last portion of risotto. Romantic tension? Not in a commercial kitchen. Tension exists in the form of shouted orders, slammed pans, and passive-aggressive side-eye across the line. After the doors close, you don't walk out to a cinematic cityscape with a freshly poured cocktail. Most nights you're dragging yourself home, covered in sweat, smelling faintly of garlic, fryer oil, and desperation. Your dinner is probably microwaved Chinese takeout, reheated pasta, or something equally uninspiring. You pour yourself a domestic beer, collapse onto a sagging couch in your basement studio apartment, and maybe put on Cartoon Network or a random streaming series to decompress. Your idea of a romantic evening is sitting still for 20 minutes without being barked at by the chef, And the highlight of your night is that the takeout isn't cold. Kitchens are intense, messy, exhausting, and full of drama. But the drama isn't glamorous. It's the kind that leaves you with sore feet, a scraped knuckle, and a sense that if you survive another shift without shouting back at someone, you've achieved a small miracle. You work long hours for little recognition, and your relationships with coworkers often hover somewhere between camaraderie and barely contained rage. Some of these people become lifelong friends, but most of the bonds are forged in fire, chaos, and sheer survival. So yes, while movies will always romanticize the kitchen as a playground for romance and artistry, real life is mostly grit, sweat, and small victories. The artistry exists, but it's buried under exhaustion and the frantic pace of service. And the romance? Well, if it exists at all, it's probably with a bag of cold takeout and the brief, blissful peace of a quiet night after a 12-hour shift. Working in a restaurant is far from glamorous, but it's real, raw, and strangely addictive. There's nothing like the adrenaline of a dinner rush, the tiny victories when every ticket hits the table perfectly, and the camaraderie that comes from surviving the chaos together. It's not Hollywood, but for anyone who's been there, it's a life that's memorable, brutal, and full of stories you can't imagine until you've lived them. Sharing a bed with someone is a lot like signing up for a live-in circus you didn't audition for. Unless you can somehow stop your partner from stealing the duvet, snoring, flailing, heating up the bed like a sauna, or, yes, even trumping, bedtime can quickly become a battlefield. I thought I married the woman of my dreams, but nighttime often reveals her secret identity. A hybrid octopus, bear, whoopee cushion. Love her to bits, by the way. But bedtime? That's a different story entirely. Separate beds are, in my experience, a gift from the sleep gods. I recently started using a big blanket just for myself, while keeping the standard covers on top for my partner. This simple tweak solved the war over stolen covers. A bigger bed, where you can roll away from the heat or encroaching limbs, also helps immensely. My partner and I eventually settled on buying 2 identical comforters. Now each of us can burrito ourselves up without fear of accidental arm theft or blanket appropriation. We got the look we wanted for the bedroom and the freedom to mummify ourselves to our heart's content. Separate bedrooms can also be a game changer when sleep schedules differ. I've seen my sleep improve 500-fold since moving into my own dedicated sleeping space. No more negotiating blanket territory at 2 a.m., no more lying awake listening to snoring patterns I swear mimic Morse code. Instead, I fall asleep quickly, stay asleep longer, and wake up feeling like a functional human. Of course, this isn't a universal truth. Some couples swear that separate beds, or worse, separate rooms, destroy intimacy. A friend of mine put it perfectly. My husband snores and sweats. I crocodile roll across the bed and spend half my night discarding and retrieving blankets. You'd think we would sleep better in our own spaces, but we both sleep horribly without each other. I have chronic pain that wakes me up, sometimes forcing me to retreat to the couch so I don't disturb him. He hates it, and usually wakes to find me. If I leave super early to tend our livestock, he claims he can't get back to sleep. If one of us is gone, we keep waking up, searching for the familiar warmth of the other body. The security, love, and comfort outweigh the annoyances, so it's still romantic for us. And I totally understand that. There are people, like another friend of mine, who struggle to fall asleep if their spouse isn't in the bed. Physical closeness is a kind of emotional security. A warm body, a familiar breathing rhythm, a hand in yours. It's grounding in ways that blankets and comforters can't replicate. I think the takeaway here is that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Some couples thrive in shared beds, tolerating minor annoyances because the intimacy and emotional connection outweigh the nightly inconveniences. Others, like me, discover that strategic separation, with clever blanket engineering, extra space, or even 2 identical comforters, allows both people to sleep better while maintaining love, connection, and affection. The end result? less nighttime friction, more energy during the day, and ultimately a healthier, happiest relationship. Love doesn't require sacrificing sleep. In fact, sometimes the best way to love someone is to let them, and yourself, sleep soundly. The bed is just one part of the relationship. And trust me, a well-rested couple is a much better couple than a tangled, half-asleep duo fighting over a single sheet.